the American West. Its landscape is beautiful, yet unforgiving. Its history is filled with adventure and promise, triumph and tragedy. Famous figures of the Old West stand out, yet thousands of unknown people make up its history. Today there are many sites, relics of the Old West, scattered about the deserts, forests, and coastlines of the American West. These sites tell the history of the people and events that took place there. I'm here in Warner Springs, California to visit a beautiful and historic chapel that was built here nearly 200 years ago. Behind me stands the St. Francis Chapel, which was constructed in the year 1830. Now, under the direction of Verona Fathers of the Catholic Church, local Cupeño Indians were forced to build this chapel essentially using local timbers and adobe. And the walls of this chapel are over 4 feet thick, which during hot summers like we're experiencing right now, you can imagine would keep the chapel much cooler. And during winters, it would also help retain some of that heat. And today, as you'll see as we walk around, some of the chapel is falling a little bit into disrepair. And part of that is because of just the weather. The hot, dry air, the strong winds that do come through this area often kind of chip away and take away from some of that structure and the foundation of the building itself. And as mentioned, this chapel was built in the year 1830 by local Cupeño Indians, and they were directed to build it and under the supervision of the Verona Fathers. Of course, we have a statue of St. Francis of Assisi here out front. And it does have a bell tower, and this tablet down here states that it is known as the Ramona Bell, which was presented and placed here in this chapel in 1945. So, 115 years after the chapel was built. And there we see the bell up there, which I was told that it still works, and you can see the rope here to pull it. As much as I would love to ring that, I don't want to confuse anybody in the area or make somebody think that I'm here doing anything nefarious. And as I've been walking around, there are a lot of different tablets and plaques that you can see. This one here caught my eye because it has a picture of the chapel from, I don't know what year, presumably in the 1940s, just based on the bell tower and the bell itself there. But, looking at that photo, the chapel looks no different. This is exactly how it would have looked 80 years ago, and presumably, other than maybe the stone bell tower, how it would have looked essentially 200 years ago when it was built. And we're just going to walk around it to admire the architecture and the beauty of it. And this is a feature that I absolutely love. These 3 stone arches you see coming off the side, providing additional support. I don't know if that was original. My guess is that it was not, based on how it is constructed. And if you look at the building, I'm not sure if it's coming out on camera, but it actually looks like it's almost leaning a little bit in this direction. So I wonder if these 3 portions, these structures, were added later, maybe around the 1940s or so, to help support and keep the building up and keep it from falling over. Because that's pretty much what it looks like these arches are doing, is supporting the building from continuing to fall in this direction. And a few years ago, this chapel ceased to be an active Catholic chapel and that they no longer hold Mass here regularly. But as we can see on the sign here, It says, "Welcome, come in, rest, pray a while. It's sure to make our dear Lord smile. We try to keep things clean and neat, so please be kind and clean your feet." So the chapel actually is open to visit at any given time. Here inside the chapel, again, not sure if it's coming out on camera, but you can actually see how this wall is leaning back into those stone supports that were built outside. So structurally, the building is definitely in rough shape. It would be very expensive to repair the right way to keep it historic and in line with the time period that it was built. So between the Palabanda Mission Indians and the Catholic Church, who still, I guess, still has a little bit of a hand in supporting the chapel, it's just a lot of money to put up to repair it. So it's kind of at a crossroads where this chapel is either going to continue to decay and fall apart and eventually one day probably collapse to include the roof, or eventually someone will put up the money to repair it, preserve it, and keep it here for generations to come so people can come, take time out of their day to pray, but also just remember their faith, the history that's here, and also remember the local tribes and the Cupeño Indians who built this, and just all the history that is here at this chapel and on these lands. But absolutely beautiful. One thing I read, which I'm not sure if this is correct, is that a local Disney artist actually painted these paintings you see. This is actually directly onto the adobe. This painting we see here, and the one of the Blessed Mother right there. And having been in the chapel now for a few minutes, I can attest that these 4-foot thick adobe walls do keep the chapel considerably cooler inside than it is outside, which is great. And again, it's so cool to think that that type of architectural design and the thought behind that has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, of using that adobe to preserve that temperature and keep it cooler inside buildings in areas like this that really do get so hot and dry and arid in the summer. But an absolutely beautiful chapel. I really hope that one day somebody is willing and able to put up the funds to preserve it and repair it, because it would be a shame if one day this building did collapse, because you're losing so much of that beautiful history. Again, religious history, history of the area, Native American history, and it is just a symbol of so many important things to remember from our past in the American West. That was very peaceful. Again, the chapel is open, I believe, at all times to the public. So if you decide to come visit and relax, maybe say a prayer, or just come to see some of the history, just please be respectful, of course, of the history here, the fragile nature of the chapel itself. And again, just kind of have that awareness and understanding of where all of this started and where all this kind of came from. And a reminder, you are on land owned by the Palabanda, the Mission Indians, so continue to just be respectful. I do want to finish walking around the building here so we can take in some of the architecture of it. Oh, that's cool. Have these small little statues here up on the corners by the roof. Even two smaller ones there up on the crossbeam. One interesting thing about this whole area, Warner Springs, California, is that there used to be very popular springs here, of course, hence the name. And for decades, it was a very popular tourist spot. And because the chapel was right here by the springs, it had a lot of interest and a lot of tourism and a lot of visitors. But since the springs are no longer popular, really no longer a tourist destination, it's just a small community. The chapel, again, not really used as much, especially since it's no longer used for Catholic Mass. Here is another tablet here, which I read earlier. I'm not going to sit here and read you the whole thing. That's a lot of words, but basically it goes into the history of this land. And it says that the Superior Court of California in 1897 chose to believe that there were no Indians living here in Cupa prior to 1850, which we know is not correct. And what I find really interesting after reading this is, as the federal government was trying to determine, okay, what are we going to do with these Cupeños who live in this area? But President Theodore Roosevelt actually visited this property and appointed a 3-man commission to either try to buy this land and give it to the Cupeños people, or determine, what is the next best or most suitable property to move them to. Which, of course, the actual Cupeño people were not happy about that regardless. And there is a quote I want to read on here from Cecilio Blacktooth. And he stated, "There is no other place for us. We do not want you to buy any other place. If you will not buy this place, we will go into the mountains like quail and die there, the old people and the women and children. Let the government be glad and proud. It can kill us. We do not fight. We do what it says. If we cannot live here, we want to go into those mountains and die. We do not want any other home." So as I was checking out the chapel up there, a gentleman drove up to check on the property, and great guy. He was explaining that he's kind of a caretaker for the tribe of this property. And he explained that this entire property, to include the chapel and a cemetery that he mentioned that I'm walking down to now, is all owned by the Pala Band of the Mission Indians. And over time, this land was, of course, taken over, really, by the federal government, and they were removed from the land. And in recent years, that property has been ultimately given back to the Pala Band of the Mission Indians in this case. And I think that's great. I think it's cool to see things start to trend back into the right direction in that sense. And he had a lot of great information all about the tribe and also the history of this land. So definitely appreciated meeting him and learning a little bit. And now I'm going to head down to the cemetery and pay my respects. So I'm actually standing on a little bit of a rise behind the chapel. And the gentleman had pointed out that a lot of these kind of dips and stuff you see in these hills all around this area are actually burial grounds in the site where many native people were buried over the years, to include this entire area that we're looking at now. Although you see this fenced off area here with grave markers, there are actually burials all around this area and the surrounding landscape. So not just within that fenced off area. And here we see one of the markers that's here on the property. This is labeled the Cupeño Trail of Tears. This tablet reads, "Long before Spaniard Fray Juan mariners settled in this valley in 1795, it was occupied by the Cupeños. The village was called Jacapan, and the surrounding area was known as Cupa. Shortly after California became a state in 1850, Jonathan Trumbull Warner claimed 47,500 acres of the Cupa territories, including the hot springs. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a decision regarding the ownership of the land on May 13, 1901, declared the Cupeños had no rights and must leave this valley. On May 12, 1903, federal troops, along with 44 armed teamsters, arrived at Warner Hot Springs to forcibly relocate 200 Cupeños to property alongside the San Luis Rey River at Pala, an area of 3,438 acres. A family was allowed one wagon to carry all their possessions. The 40-mile journey took 3 days from Cupa to Pala. The Cupeños called their journey the Trail of Tears. And honestly, what's really interesting is in most U.S. history classes, hopefully students are still learning about the Trail of Tears and the forcible removal of Native American tribes and the American southeast and east over towards the west onto reservations. But what many may not realize is out here in California, all the way up into the 1900s, so not that long ago, you had events that were similarly labeled the Trail of Tears, where native tribes and native people were forcibly removed from their land that their ancestors may have lived on for centuries and centuries. And again, we see in 1901 the same thing had happened, and this one was known as the Cupeño Trail of Tears. Okay, now we're going to go check out at least the fenced-off portion of the cemetery. And of note, it is labeled as no trespassing. It is owned by the Pala Band of Mission Indians. But as mentioned, the gentleman I met who works with them said that I'm okay to go ahead and come down here and pay my respects. One thing I did learn is that this is actually still an active cemetery. And here we see some of the more modern grave markers for members of the tribe that have died in recent years. And if you get a chance to come out here, the landscape and everything truly is so beautiful. And it is such a peaceful and beautiful place to be laid to rest. This tablet caught my eye because I always recognize a military tablet. And here, this is in memory of Charles F. Keene Sr., who served in the United States Navy. He was born March 25th, 1935, and passed away on August 30th, 1997. And I'm not sure you see these wooden crosses here right up and tied into the fence line. I'm not sure if that means there are grave sites right here along the fence line, but as mentioned, there are many well beyond this fenced-off property, so I'm sure there are loved ones laid to rest all throughout these hills in this area. All right, so finishing up my time here down at the cemetery, now I'm going to head back up the hill towards the chapel and head a little bit down the road to one other historic site I wanted to check out before I leave the area. Well, if you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I like to check out ruins anywhere I can find them. And as I was driving down the 79, which actually in this stretch coincides with much of the original Butterfield Stagecoach line, this stone structure caught my eye. And it does show up on Google Maps as the Rock Shack. I'm not sure if this used to be like a frontier homestead or if this was just like a storage place or what. But according to this sign, it is U.S. property and there's no trespassing. And if that sign weren't enough, the barbed wire fence kind of dissuades me from going any further. So unfortunately, I won't be able to check it out, but just thought this was kind of interesting. Again, saw it when I drove by. And like with anything out here in the Old West, with the stone structures that are collapsed and overgrown, I'm always curious, what was that used for? Who used it? Who lived here? So anyway, always cool to see. Getting to check out a nearly 200-year-old historic chapel and just see that and see the architecture and how it was built is pretty special. But what I really take away from today is that I learned a lot about this local area and the Warner Springs area and some of the native tribes that used to live here. To think that President Teddy Roosevelt actually visited out here to kind of figure out where to move the Cupeños people and the Cupeño Trail of Tears, which I'd never heard of, learning about that and getting a deeper understanding of what took place in this area adds to our understanding of American history and the history of the West. And one thing I think about a lot is I'm a fan of genealogical research. I like to learn about my ancestors, and I hope that any place in Ireland or Scotland or other areas that my ancestors had lived or were buried and lived out their lives, I'd hope that people visiting that would respect those areas and want to learn more about my ancestors and what they did and where they lived and how they lived. So I think about that, and I think about that framework when I visit places like this. I want to respect the site, respect the cemeteries and the burial grounds, and hopefully come away with a better understanding of who those people were, what their lives were like, and what they went through. Because again, all of that rolled up together makes up our history, not just of the United States, but of the world and of humanity. So had a really good time, and I learned a lot. Hopefully you guys did too, and enjoyed coming along with me. But that's going to be it for this one. Now it's on to the next journey.